I price fishing tackle for a living. People slide it across a pawn counter, and in about 4 seconds I have to tell them what it is worth. And here is the thing the person on the other side of that glass never wants to hear. The cheapest reel in the whole case, the little push-button one a kid could run, was drawn up by a watchmaker. Built by a company that made bombs. I will come back to that one. It is number one for a reason. Because the gap I see every single day is not the gap between cheap gear and good gear. It is the gap between what you paid and what the thing actually does. And the fish, the only judge that matters, has never once asked to see the receipt. So today we walk the Walmart fishing aisle. 15 items most anglers step straight past, somewhere between the motor oil and the pool noodles. Not beginner compromises. Tools with world records, tournament wins, and in a few cases, 100 years of water behind them. We are counting down from 15. Number 15. There is a little curl of soft plastic hanging on a peg here, a few cents a piece, called a curly tail grub. Picture the tail of a tadpole, that lazy figure eight it draws in the water without even trying. That ribbon of motion is the entire product. Before 1972, soft plastic was a stiff, dead worm that just hung there and did nothing. A man named Welle saw a clumsy French lure with a curled tail at a tackle show and worked out how to make that curl come alive on its own, at any speed you reeled. He called his company Mr. Twister. He went on to sell something like 500 million of them, and then every other plastic on this wall copied the tail. That is the tell. You cannot patent a wiggle once it is loose in the world. The shape became free, which is exactly why nobody is running ads for the original anymore. Thread one onto a plain jig head, and it will outfish plastics that cost 5 times as much, because the fish is reading the motion, not the name on the bag. Number 14. This one was, almost literally, a kitchen spoon. Back in 1920, a retired Chicago foundry man named Lewis Johnson got sick of weeds fouling his hooks, so he soldered a wire and a hook onto the bowl of a tablespoon. He made it thicker in the middle than at the edges, and that single detail quietly does 2 jobs at once. The hook rides point up, so the lure slides over the grass instead of grabbing it, and the body rocks side to side instead of spinning, so your line never winds itself into a bird's nest. They call it the silver minnow. Real silver plate, because silver throws a whiter flash underwater than chrome does. 100 years on the market, almost no changes, and here is why you never see it pushed. There is nothing left to improve, and nothing to resell. A lure that has been right since 1920 does not give anyone a reason to put it on a billboard. Tip it with one of those curly tails from a moment ago, crawl it over the slop, and watch a heavy bass come up through the salad to eat it. Number 13. A spinner, a blade on a wire that spins when you reel. The classic is the Meps Aglia, and the name itself gives the whole game away. MEPS is a French acronym that translates, word for word, to precision equipment for sport fishing. A French engineer patented that blade in 1938, and it crossed the ocean in just about the strangest way a lure ever has. A soldier coming home from the war had an arrangement with a woman in France who mailed him spinners in exchange for nylon stockings. Stockings for spinners. A tackle shop owner in Wisconsin tied one on during a miserable day on the river and put 4 trout in the creel inside 2 hours. The reason it works is plain physics. A turning blade throws flash and pushes a steady rhythmic thump out into the water, and a fish feels that thump on its skin before it ever lays an eye on the blade. We will get to that skin in a few minutes, because it is the single most important thing on this whole aisle, and nobody sells it to you. For now, $2 or $3, and it catches just about everything that swims. Number 12. A soft jerkbait, the Zoom Super Fluke. Around $5 for a bag of 10. It looks like nothing at all in your hand, a flat, forked piece of plastic, with a slot cut down its belly to hide the hook. But rig it with no weight, give the rod tip a twitch, and it darts and glides like a shad that just took a hit and cannot quite swim straight. That dying baitfish stagger is the trigger. It has won millions of dollars in tournaments, sitting in the very same bag you can grab for pocket change. The expensive Japanese version moves the same way for 4 times the money, because the action lives in the plastic, not the packaging. Number 11. A clear plastic box, the Plano 3700. Plano started molding plastic back in 1952, and that exact tray size became the quiet standard the entire sport is built around. Here is the part that should bother you a little. A lot of those $80 and $150 tournament tackle bags are Plano 3700 trays, the same trays, zipped inside a fancy shell. The tray does the actual work. The shell is where the markup lives. $12 buys you the tray on its own, with the rubber seal that keeps your hooks from rusting. You are paying for that engineering either way. The only real question is whether you also pay for the logo wrapped around it. Number 10. A spool of line. Berkeley Trilene, $5 to $7. Berkeley has been making this monofilament since the 1970s, and it is not the budget option. It is the reference line other companies measure themselves against. It is legal for world records. Now, the counter at the shop will steer you toward fluorocarbon every time, on the strength of a single word: invisible. It is not. Fluorocarbon bends light a little closer to the way water does, so it is less visible. Not gone. Less visible and invisible are not the same word, and the box quietly hopes you will not notice the gap between them. For most freshwater fishing, good mono does everything you actually need. The spool at Walmart is the same line as the one on the specialty shop shelf, minus the markup. Just replace it every season. Sunlight is what kills monofilament, not price. Number 9. The cheapest thing in the entire aisle, a pack of hooks. And the oldest story in it. The two names you will see are Eagle Claw and Mustad. Eagle Claw came out of Denver in 1925. Two fishermen who watched an eagle pin a fish with its talon and built a hook bent to the very same curve. But Mustad goes all the way back to a blacksmith shop in Norway in 1832. And Mustad is where the spine of this whole video shows its teeth. Back then, every hook on earth was bent by hand. Slow, expensive work. A carpenter at the factory figured out how to build a machine that cut, bent, barbed, and pointed a hook automatically, faster than anyone alive could. And here is what they did with it. They did not patent it. A patent is public. It tells the whole world how you did the thing. So instead, they hid the machines, walled them off, made the workers sign their silence away. Think about what that means, standing right here holding a 40-cent pack of hooks. The precision in that little piece of steel was a guarded secret for 100 years. It was never a story anyone could sell you. It was a story someone worked very hard to keep. The hook is the one piece of tackle that genuinely has to be perfect. Everything else is just delivery, and it is the cheapest thing on the wall. Number 8. A spinning reel that makes serious anglers squint when you tell them the price. The Daiwa BG, the black gold, under $90. Daiwa is one of the two giants of Japanese reel making, and the BG has an aluminum body wrapped in a one-piece frame Daiwa calls a monocoque. That word is borrowed from a real idea, a structure that carries its strength in its outer skin, like an eggshell or the fuselage of an aircraft, instead of bolting a separate frame inside. In a reel, that means the body does not flex when a heavy fish surges, so the drag stays smooth instead of stuttering and giving up line in jerks. And the version hanging on the Walmart peg is not a watered-down copy. It is the same reel sold everywhere else, at the same price. The people who go quiet are not wrong about the reel. They are just surprised that the engineering was never the expensive part. Number 7. A lipless crankbait, the Strike King Red Eye Shad, about $8. Strike King is the brand Kevin Van Dam threw, and Van Dam is the most decorated tournament bass angler the sport has produced. 4 Bassmaster Classic titles, and millions in tournament winnings. His cold water weapon is a lure off this peg. In freezing water, when the bass are sulking and have not eaten in days, you let it sink, rip it up hard, and let it fall again. A yo-yo, over and over. That sudden flash and fall snaps a reaction out of a fish that was not even hungry. It carries tungsten rattles inside, the loud little component the boutique baits charge double for. Same trigger, a third of the price. The fish responds to the fall and the sound. It has never once responded to the name printed on the box. Number 6. A plain cooler. And the biggest marketing magic trick in the whole outdoors. Igloo has been building coolers in Texas since 1947. Then, somewhere around 2012, a new breed of premium cooler convinced an entire generation that keeping a fish cold had suddenly become a $300 problem. So let us use numbers instead of feelings. Food safe means holding your catch at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below. And the thing that decides whether you hit that number is not the brand on the lid. It is the ice ratio. 2 parts ice to 1 part fish, by volume. A $25 igloo with the right amount of ice holds food-safe fish through a full day on the water, the same as the premium box parked right next to it. The high-end cooler keeps drinks cold a day longer on a long expedition. That part is real. But for a Saturday on the lake, you are often buying a status symbol dressed up as a science experiment, and the fish in the slush cannot tell the difference. One honest note, because this one touches your dinner. Keep your fish on ice and out of the sun, and when you are ever in doubt about whether something is still good to eat, throw it out. Cold is cheap. A bad fish dinner is not. Number 5. A little jar of dough. Berkeley Power Bait. Under $5. And it is the doorway to the most important thing on this entire aisle. The thing the tackle wall has almost no reason to ever explain to you. To understand why a jar of scented dough can outfish live bait, you have to meet a scientist named John Caprio at Louisiana State University, who spent a career mapping how a catfish actually tastes the water around it. And what he found rewires how you think about scent. A catfish is not an animal with taste buds tucked inside its mouth. A catfish is, in a real sense, a swimming tongue. The taste receptors run across its entire body, head to tail. So when anglers argue about which scent works, we are asking a question the fish answers with its skin. It can pick up certain compounds dissolved in the water at almost unimaginably tiny amounts. Now, the honest version. Berkeley's own fish research lab, and I will tell you straight, that is a lab owned by the company that sells the bait, built power bait around exactly that sense. The dough floats, so on a light rig it lifts up off the bottom into the fish's line of sight while it leaks a scent trail. You will hear that garlic or anise is scientifically proven. Be careful with that phrase. The mechanism, fish reading the water through smell and taste, is rock solid. The claim that one kitchen shelf scent is a proven magic bullet is not, and what is actually true is more than enough. A buoyant, scent-leaking bait works 2 senses at once, sight and smell, for the price of a coffee. The biology is real. The hype around the exact recipe is the part you can leave on the shelf. Everything we have covered so far, the 15 items, the rig that makes each one work, and the sources, so you can check every claim against the science yourself, is gathered onto a single page you can tape inside your tackle box lid. Point your phone at the code on the screen, and it is yours. No charge. Nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me. Because the last 4 items are the ones I started with back at the counter. The watchmakers and the bomb makers. And number 1 is the strangest story in the whole aisle. Number 4. A reel with a Swedish accent and a secret in its blood. In 1921, in a small village called Svangsta, a master craftsman founded a company called, in plain translation, the Watch Factory. They made pocket watches, telephone timers, the little meters that tick over in the back of a taxi. Then the war came, the taxi meter orders dried up, and the founder's son, a man who loved to fish, asked one simple question. The same precision that makes a watch keep perfect time, what if you pointed it at a fishing reel? In 1952, they released the Ambassadeur, and it made every other reel of its day feel medieval. Tolerances like a watch. You will find that same bloodline on the Walmart peg today, the cardinal among the names, built to the same idea their founder started with. A reel is a precision instrument, not a fashion item. And here is the quiet irony running underneath this whole aisle. That little Swedish watch factory is now owned by Pure Fishing, a giant American tackle conglomerate. The heritage is genuine. The economics are precisely why the cheap end of the rack stays invisible. There is far more margin in selling you the next new thing than in reminding you a watchmaker already solved this in 1952. Number 3. A wooden minnow that has caught more record fish than anything else ever tied to the end of a line. Finland, 1936. A subsistence fisherman named Lauri Rapala, a man who fished to feed his family, not for sport, could not afford a manufactured lure, so he carved one. out of cork. He wrapped it in foil, peeled off a chocolate wrapper for flash, and sealed it with melted-down photographic film, because he had no varnish to use. Then he watched the water, and he shaped that lure until it limped across the surface, exactly like a wounded baitfish, because he had noticed the big fish always take the cripple first. That is the whole secret. And it is a secret about observation, not chemistry. A Rapala wobbles with a slightly irregular, off-balance roll, the fingerprint of a hand-carved original, and that little imperfection reads as injured to a predator in a way a perfectly uniform plastic still struggles to fake. $9 on the peg. You will hear it called outdated. The framing is outdated. The biology a hungry pike was born with has not changed one bit since a poor man in Finland carved the first one out of cork. Number 2. The rod the snobs love to hate. The ugly stick. Shakespeare has been building tackle since 1897, older than nearly every brand selling you a $300 rod today. The ugly stick launched in 1976 with a slogan that practically dared you to laugh. Ugly by name, ugly by nature. It bonds a fiberglass spine to graphite and finishes with a solid glass tip you almost cannot break. Now here is the part that is pure physics, and it runs straight against everything the premium rack tells you. A $300 high graphite rod is stiff and hypersensitive, and on a crankbait, that stiffness works against you. Picture a fish thrashing its head right at the boat, 3 treble hooks barely pinned in its jaw. A stiff rod sends every one of those head shakes straight into the hooks and levers them out. A rod that bends deep, the way the ugly stick does, soaks up those head shakes and keeps the hooks buried. This is not budget folklore. The premium brands sell dedicated fiberglass composite crankbait rods for $150 to $400 on this exact principle. A video that went around a few years back showed an angler landing a tarpon, a genuinely big fish, on a $40 ugly stick off the Walmart rack. The rod loaded through the whole fight instead of fighting back. You cannot sell nearly unbreakable twice. A rod that survives a decade of abuse is a rod you do not replace, which is precisely why the wall would so much rather sell you the fragile, beautiful one all over again next season. And number 1, the reel I picked up at the counter at the very start of all this. In 1947, a West Texas watchmaker named R.D. Hull stood at a grocery meat counter and watched the clerk pull string off a fixed spool without a single tangle. And a watchmaker's brain saw a fishing reel in it, a reel that could never backlash, never bird's nest, because the line peeled off a spool that never spun. He took the idea to a company in Tulsa called the 0 Hour Bomb Company. Read that name again, a bomb company. They built electric time bombs, dropped down oil wells to crack the rock and free the crude below. America's first true push-button reel was designed by a clockmaker and built by people who made explosives for the oil field. The Zebco 33 arrived in 1954 for $19.50. More than 40 million of them have sold since. The mechanism is so simply, perfectly right that it has barely changed in 70 years. And that is the entire point of this aisle, standing in one little push-button reel. The precision that catches fish came from a watchmaker. The toughness came from a bomb factory. None of it came from a marketing department, and none of it can be patented fresh or resold to you every spring, which is the only reason a $35 reel that outlasts a $300 one gets quietly filed under beginner gear. The fish never got that memo. It is still out there, hitting the same lure, completely indifferent to what your reel cost. So come back to that pawn counter with me for one last second. When someone slides one of these across the glass, the number I give them is almost never the number they were hoping for. A whole lifetime of being told that price is proof, that the expensive thing simply must be the better thing, and the little reel in their hand quietly says otherwise. 15 items. The whole list, bought new, runs around $300. The specialty shop version of the very same setup runs closer to $1,000. That gap is not quality. It is the cost of a barrier that mass production tore down 70 years ago, and that premium marketing has spent the last 20 years quietly building back up. 400 years ago, the first great book ever written about this sport already made the same case, in its own century's words, that what the angler knew mattered more than what the angler owned. The watchmakers knew it. The blacksmiths knew it. The poor man in Finland carving cork knew it. The fish have always known it. If you would rather fish knowing what the wall will not tell you, what you are paying for, versus what the thing actually does, then you already know which side of this counter you are standing on. Subscribe, and we will keep pulling the rest of this aisle back into the light, one piece at a time.